All right, welcome to another flip lecture, this one on the French and Indian War, which really sets us up for the beginning of the American Revolution. So we're going to sort of explore a few questions in this lecture. What sense of colonial unity existed in British America in the 18th century? Was there a unique colonial identity? And how was 1763, the end of the French and Indian War, a turning point in the relationships between Great Britain and her colonies in America? So, what's happening in the colonies? Well, they're moving away from European traditions and ways. One, the governments here, the local governments and the state, what become the state governments, are more democratic. Every colony had a representative assembly elected by its male voters, and there were no political offices that could be dominated by a single aristocratic family. So very different from European traditions. There was also a greater sense of religious toleration here in the colonies. Almost all the colonies permitted the practice of other religions, primarily Protestant faiths, and Rhode Island and Pennsylvania actually offered religious asylum for other faiths. You also have a unique American press that is being formed, and it's really this unique American press which allows government to be transparent. Newspapers grew in number and popularity throughout the 18th century. They were the primary method of spreading news throughout the colonies, and they had relative freedom of press until they didn't, and that was when we had the Zanger Trial. John Peter Zenger was a publisher who was arrested and charged with libel, which means basically spreading lies against the colonial governor. And he basically was writing about the truth, which was that the governor was engaged in an adulterous relationship. Zanger's lawyer actually argued in front of a judge that what he wrote was true, so it wasn't libel, and it's about having malicious intent and spreading malicious lies. And English law says it didn't matter if it was true or not. If you didn't like it, you could accuse someone of libel. A jury actually acquits, which means finds Zanger not guilty, and since what he was publishing was the truth. So it establishes a precedent in the colonies, not necessarily of total freedom of the press, but it gives the press sort of more confidence to take greater risks and actually criticize government and public officials more heavily. The Zenger decision was a landmark case, and it eventually, once we do become a United States, paves the way for the Free Press Clause in our First Amendment. So this is in 1734 and 1735. And the governor was charged with libel, and Alexander Hamilton actually played a role in this case. You also have the Mercantilist Wars. So the French and the English were at sort of having a trade war go on, and England decided to pass some mercantilist policies that changed economic and military attitudes towards the colonies. They're reining in that salutary neglect. They increased protective tariffs to create trade regulations so that the colonies would work specifically for the motherland. And as those failed or didn't work, they would actually go to war with their economic rivals and try to get the colonists to fight in those wars as well. So these regulations began as the Navigation Acts in 1660, and the French and Indian War changed everything between England and the colonies. These new mercantilist policies after the French and Indian War led to colonial resentment and the American Revolution. So, what were the French and Indian Wars? Well, it's actually kind of a series of wars. Well, the colonial wars are a series of wars and conflict that involved England and France, and actually were primarily happening on the continent of Europe, but happened to spill over onto the colonies. You had King William's War from 1689 to 1697, Queen Anne's War from 1702 to 1713, and King George's War from 1743 to 1748. They were based on mercantilist competition and had little significance except that it totally changed the map of the colonies. You know, here, this is what we saw, that France had all of this territory, and then after the French and Indian War, the British ended up with most of that territory. So you also had territorial disputes along the Ohio River. as British colonists are pushing into this Ohio River Valley seeking more land. So it is really westward expansion and land conflicts in the 1750s to 1775 that you see these things outbreak. You have the Paxton Boys out in the Appalachian Mountains. You have the North Carolina Regulators, who you'll read about in Howard Zinn, who are sort of rebelling against their colonial government and ultimately the crown as well. So 1754 turns out to be kind of a turning point in American colonial history. In 1754, English officials and colonists met to discuss the Iroquois problems because the Iroquois were sort of pushing back at the Albany Congress. Benjamin Franklin proposed the Albany Plan of Union, which would have coordinated a colonial army. The plan was vetoed by the colonial assemblies and by the British Parliament, but it is the first attempt at unification among the colonies. Parliament refused it because it feared that it would give the colonists too much power. And it was too expensive and would limit each colony's power to control its own actions. So already you're starting to see some of the arguments, especially with regards to the pink here, that come up when we go to draft a constitution. These unique colonies, or what become unique states, don't always get along with everything and don't want to be told what to do by some centralized government. So Ben Franklin's Albany Plan of Union, he's trying to encourage, and he published the first American political cartoon of this snake chopped in pieces saying join or die, meaning we won't work unless we are all united. So here is the turning point with the disputed land in 1754. The Virginia governor sent 22-year-old George Washington to protect the Ohio Company claim in this Ohio River Valley at Fort Duquesne. Washington's troops were forced to retreat from Fort Duquesne, and this clash actually began the French and Indian War. The war went bad for England from 1756 to 1758, and in 1757, the Prime Minister William Pitt took command of the military. He used well-qualified generals. He had a blank check to actually fund the war in America, India, and Europe, and sort of turn the tide. And then by 1760, the English had won. So you can see by 1761, Spain had become an ally of France. The map dramatically has changed. You can see a lot of it was coming in through Canada and fighting here along the Great Lakes. Most of the battles were in the Great Lakes region. The French sided with the Iroquois, or maybe the Iroquois sided with the French on this one. France, as a result of the Treaty of Paris, lost Canada, most of its empire in India, and claims to lands east of the Mississippi River. Spain got all of the French lands west of the Mississippi River, New Orleans, but lost Florida to England. England gained all the French lands in Canada and exclusive rights to the Caribbean slave trade and total control over India. So here's North America after the French and Indian War. So we've added all this huge territory, but that becomes even more difficult to regulate. Here it is in 1750. Here it is in 1763, side by side. So you can see the dramatic shift. Basically, Great Britain going all the way to the Mississippi River. So there were two different perceptions of this war. The first being the perceptions of the colonists. They could be very strong when they worked together. They had a newly gained frontier land that meant it was sort of an infinite amount of land. People could continue to push into it. And colonial commanders had actually learned how to fight. The English viewed the Americans they thought they were lazy, it had taken forever to fight, they balked at helping to raise money to protect their own lands, and so that created some resentment in England of the colonies. You had different varieties of fighting methods. The colonials had a more Indian-style guerrilla attack military organization. The militias were led by captains, and they resisted rising taxes. The British Their traditional fighting method was marching in formation, very old style of fighting. British officers were in charge of the colonials, and the colonists should pay for their own defense, was the feeling. So was it a turning point, the end of the war, in British colonial relationships? Well, what were the effects? The war increased England's colonial empire, but Pitt's blank check greatly enlarged England's debt. So as he is waging this war pretty much without anyone telling him how much to spend, England is paying for it and footing the bill, and it's very costly. Britain's contempt for the colonials creates bitter feelings in Britain, and as a result, England's leaders felt that a major reorganization of the American empire was necessary. So we got to fix it, they thought. So the French and Indian War united the colonists against a common enemy for the first time, the French, and then later the British. The 1760s were a fluent and optimistic post-war period with little thought of independence. Most colonists in the 1760s were also considered, we would call them today loyalists. They were proud members of the English Empire. But those bonds begin to erode as Parliament and the king attempts to assert their power over the colonies and get the colonies to get back into line and to pay for its war debt. George III becomes king in 1760, and he begins a new colonial attitude called Parliamentary Sovereignty, where English officials assume that Parliament must have ultimate authority of all laws and taxes. The colonists attempted to reserve their colonial authority for their own legislatures and maintain some autonomy and self-government. The colonists assumed that their assemblies were quasi-equal to Parliament because they had no parliamentary representatives. That was a mistake on their part because Britain never said that they did. British officials countered with the argument that they were virtually representing the colonists and keeping them in good mind when they were making decisions. But the colonists continued to insist that actually it was only the colonial assemblies which could tax Americans. So this is where you get this idea of no taxation without representation. So Parliament under virtual representation represents all British citizens no matter where they live. So you have two theories of representation that evolved. What was the extent of Parliament's authority over the colonies? Was it absolute or was it limited? How could the colonies accept the decisions of Parliament when they did not have representation in that body? And that's a huge issue. It was a 2 to 3 month voyage to get across the Atlantic, and then by the time decisions are made by Parliament, they're slow to be enforced. And so when you need decisions made quickly, is it best that Parliament is the sole decision maker? After what in Europe is called the 7 Years' War, and here it is called the French and Indian War, everyone expected George III to remove the British army from America, at least where the French were no longer a threat. But the large, expensive army was not removed. British citizens were not happy because they had to pay for it, and colonists doubted the army's value against the Native Americans. And this is proved when the backcountry natives in the western frontier sort of banded together under Pontiac, and it's Pontiac's War, Pontiac's Rebellion, really begins to expose British Army's weaknesses. They attack the citizens in the frontier, and they reveal sort of a desperation on the part of the Native Americans after the withdrawal of the French, who had a better relationship with them. So colonials take matters into their own hands, create their own militias, such as the Paxton Boys in Pennsylvania, and they basically go out and conduct massacres in Indian villages and fight against the Native Americans on their own. There's all this land and no French, and here you have the British giving gifts of smallpox-infected blankets from Fort Duquesne, and attacks by Indians in the Ohio River Valley, Scioto River, right here in Ohio, Fort Sandusky. This is all these backcountry battles that were being waged, and attacks on by the Paxton Boys on Native Americans. And we'll stop there and pick up in a few minutes.